Welcome to Prose Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Good morning, evening, or night, ladies and gentlemen. This is Alex Eldridge and James Healy doing a special episode of the Prose Cons podcast, where sometimes we feel like pros and sometimes we feel like cons. We figured for this one, because me and James are both very much caught up in the sort of horror side of writing, it might be a fun thing just to do a back and forth on, you know, what we like about horror, what horror means to us, all that sort of stuff in a more, you know, intimate one-on-one sort of interview style thing. So we'll just go back and forth and do that. So if you like horror, this is definitely the podcast for you. But I will start with our usuals. James, what have you been reading and listening to?
Well, definitely, probably in good preparation for this episode, I've been listening to some horror podcasts just the last couple of days. Limetown and The Ice Vault.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Quite good horror podcasts on Spotify. Sort of just telling stories of with the Ice Vault is a team researchers take out to a isolated outpost out in the middle of, I feel like it's somewhere Scandinavian, and they kind of end up making some discoveries and getting kind of trapped and isolated and stuff, which is quite good. And then Limetown is an investigation of a small community of people that disappeared, basically. Interviewers kind of tracking down people and trying to figure out what was going on there and what happened. So
that's
still a lot of fun.
That's not true crime, is it? That second one, that's still like horror?
No, it's fictional. Yeah, fictional story.
Cool. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that sounds really good. I think that was recommended to us by our mutual friend Nate Gothard. So yeah. I've got to jump onto those as well. Yeah, cool. I got stuck into Moby Dick for a little bit, and it was really
nice. Moby Dick is back up again.
Yeah, it is. It is literally this group's white whale, literally and figuratively. But I'm just keeping that as a coffee table book. The good thing about Moby Dick is it is actually quite short. The chapters themselves are quite short, so you can just read a bit for like 3-4 pages. And kind of just go like, okay, cool, that's enough. I'll put this down for now. So I'm just keeping that as like a coffee table book, working my way through that. But what I've really been invested in recently is actually Ready Player One. I never read it and I never saw the movie. And it's good. It's like it's really well plotted. Like the story moves along a bit. If you can get past the sort of juvenilia of the constant like 80s references, or you know, if you me, that's actually a feature and not a bug. It is, yeah, it's pretty engaging. So yeah, I've been enjoying reading that. I started reading it at this cafe, and I would just go in there, and I realized after a couple of weeks I was literally just going in there to read the book. So I bought a copy of the book for myself, and then only sometimes go into the cafe now. Yeah. So that's what I've been doing. Anything else? I've been playing Hollow Knight as well, which is a really kind of like Dark Souls-like Metroidvania, if those words mean anything to anyone. You just basically, it's a platformer. You run around and kill things, and you know, just discover this big world. It's really, really good. Very, very good game. Okay, so to the main event. I figured we'd discuss some stuff with horror. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, James, is what do you think is it that draws you to horror specifically? What is there something inherent about it that you like, or is it something you've always liked, or is it something you've discovered more recently? What's the deal?
I think it was definitely probably something I always enjoyed reading, even at a relatively young age. I think I liked scary stories. I think I quite liked dark stories, or stories that kind of took a turn, I guess, that they kind of didn't go down the expected route.
Yeah.
Twist. Kind of, delved into something a little bit more complicated. So I think I was always quite interested in them. My father was a huge Stephen King fan, and he used to read me The Shining and The Green Mile and stuff when I was a kid.
Cool.
The big thing in there. He also used to tell me stories, which were actually just him telling me stories of like films he'd seen that I would have been too young to have watched. But he would slightly change the details to kind of make stuff up. So when I got older and I started watching famous films like Jaws, Jurassic Park, The Terminator, The Shining, and all of these things, I was like, oh, these aren't just like that stories. This is what actually happened. He just embellished.
Oh, that's
different parts of
cool.
them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so that was a lot of fun. My sister also was a huge Stephen King fan, and she would have read. She actually got me into Stephen King. She read his whole collection, and then was always telling me about like stuff that happened in it and that stuff that happened in different things. So when I started reading Stephen King, we had a lot to talk about, me and her.
Sure.
And I think that was probably what just got me started in writing it, because I would have started writing around 17 or 18 after having like kind of read quite a bit of Stephen King. So I think what I was always trying to do was a bit of action horror.
Hmm.
But I seemed to like just really lean into the tension, writing stuff that had a lot of tension in it.
Yeah.
And that ended up being something that was my favorite thing to do, was to develop a good setup and then kind of play with drawing out the tension as much as possible.
Hmm.
And then, you know, you either land the ending or you don't land the ending. So I became quite, you get a lot of enjoyment out of pulling off landing that ending if you can do it. But I do really enjoy the building block of stretching the tension out in the middle of the story. How about yourself?
Yeah. So I think in the same way, I'd always been interested in kind of darker, spookier stories. I remember back in the day there was a really famous children's author called Paul Jennings in Australia, and he had this series that was like unreal, un unwound, unbelievable, like, and there were all these short stories that would have these really, they were like the stories themselves. I read back some of them recently, and they're pitched at kids, but the concepts in them were like really terrifying. Like the idea of like this guy who would, the one that sticks out is like this guy who would go down to this, he was just exploring and he found this thing and he found like a room, and he got into the room, and then like suddenly parts of his clothes started coming off, and like he like all these different bits until like his last like sock was gone, and then like this other kid like ran out of the room, and he said, oh, I'll come back, and he discovered that like he was locked in the room, and basically
Wow.
he gets locked in there for like hundreds of years or something, like it sort of stretches time or something, and then this other kid comes and find him, and he does the same thing. He's like, I'll come back for you, and then he goes and like they put him into a mental asylum, and like, which is obviously what happened to the first guy, and it's like that's fucking terrifying. Like
Absolutely.
imagine like this, it was a library, so we had stuff to read, but like it's just like stuff like that I just found so compelling. I was like, this is wow. Like just that idea that you like start in one place, like you said, and then you go down, and then it just really opens up, and you're like, this was not what I was expecting at all. It's like there's this, it's very like, I don't even know the word. I don't even really know the word for it, but it's just it just kind of opens up at some point, and you're like, wow, this is a whole different thing, which is what I think I like about weird fiction. And then when I was I wrote a bunch when I was a kid, and then when I was about maybe 27, I discovered Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. There's the Stephen King pin counter is going to be pinging pretty hard.
Yeah, two big Stephen King fans here today.
Yeah,
Yeah, that'll be going off.
And I read that, and that really got me back into reading stories, because that book is incredible. It's got the mist in it. It's got the rafts. Just some really really banger Stephen King ones. And then I was like, right, okay, well, I guess this is what I'm going to do now. And then it kind of went from there. Yeah, but so I think the thing about horror that is so engaging, I think, just on maybe this is just a little bit bigger in sort of you and me than it is in the general populace, is that I feel like there's an ability, like I feel like the human experience is probably pretty fraught with like grim stuff, and like horrible things you just have to deal with every day, and you're kind of hardwired to deal with that. And in the modern world, we don't really have to deal with much of that anymore. Like, there's a lot less chance that your sister's going to die of typhoid, or your father will get run down by a horse or something, or you'll be in a war, like, or at least a battle. Like those things don't really happen. So fiction is almost like this, maybe this release valve where it's like, oh, here's some spooky stuff that I'm not getting in my everyday sort of life. And I think some people are more akin to that than others. What was your reaction to like horror movies back in the day when you were a kid? Did you get a chance to sort of watch many, or?
I wouldn't have been allowed to watch horror films. My friends would have all like stayed up late and taped horror films and stuff. I think I found them quite frightening when I was in my kind of previous to being a teen. I would have found them quite frightening. But then when I got a bit older and I was a teen and I started watching horror films, I didn't find them scary at all for whatever reason. And
Yeah.
I rarely find films that scary. Whereas I have found books to be something like really makes my heart stop. Because I don't know why it is. It's kind of you feel like you're getting closer and closer and closer to the car crash or whatever it is it's going to
Yeah.
happen. So I really enjoy that. I also quite like certain video games give you that same feeling. You
Yeah.
know you have to progress deeper into the area, and you know that something is going to come out. So I think that has the same feeling of you have to progress through the story. You have to
Yeah.
progress deeper into the haunted space station or whatever it is.
Yeah, you're right. You're
So I
right
quite like
there.
that.
And you just have to deal with it. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast recently about this game called Amnesia, the Bunker, and it just sounds horrific. I have this thing where I actually don't play a lot of like full-on horror video games because I just find that jump scare aspect too much. But I listen to these like games club overviews of them with this special thing, so I like know the plot and the beats of a lot of them. It's a really strange thing. So I'll go through and just like listen to and know about them. It's I guess it's the equivalent of doing a Wikipedia deep dive on a movie or something. But yeah, I was the same. When I was a kid, I was really, really scared by horror movies. I remember seeing 13 Ghosts when I was like maybe 11, and that like deeply scarred me. And then I went back and looked at it recently, and it's so silly. Like it's really
That's
silly.
not really have the goggles where they can see the ghosts, isn't it? Is that that
Oh,
one?
I think so. Yeah, with the big
Yeah,
like there's a machine in the middle of the house, and there's the
yeah, yeah.
juggernaut who's like just charges through walls, and yeah, I was like, this is terrifying. But yeah, again, like conceptually, really, really scary. Like the idea that you could trap these entities and use it to power this house. It's like that's so ghoulish. It's really grim.
Cool, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So well, you mentioned before that you had some books that really, made you sort of seize up. What do you think? What are some examples of those? Because I find it's pretty hard for books to scare me most of the time. Not always, but sometimes.
I really loved The Whisperer in the Dark by H.P. Lovecraft. Um, it's the one where it's a kind of correspondence between two lads, and one of them has essentially he lives out in the middle of the woods and stuff, and he think he's discovered signs that there's aliens or something in the area. He's found some weird fish thing in the river or something that shouldn't be there.
Of course.
But he starts to get the feeling that people from the village are like in league with these aliens, and then that they're trying to silence him, they're trying to prevent him from corresponding with this guy. So the protagonist is like in New York and he's safe, and he's getting correspondence with this other lad, and this other lad is essentially telling him of these like what essentially like escalates into kind of like almost nightly attempts of these things to get into his house.
Oh God.
And he has dogs, and he's kind of running around trying to keep them out. And it's absolutely, I remember reading it being like feeling my heart like beating harder and harder and harder.
Yeah.
And I don't think H.P. Lovecraft often, he very rarely writes characters who are in any way capable of dealing with what's happening. So this is, I think, the one example of a character who was kind of competently somewhat combating what was happening, but things were getting worse and worse.
Oh, cool.
Um,
I got to
and
read
then all
that.
of a
I actually
sudden,
haven't read that one.
it's great. I won't tell any more of them because it's
Yeah.
really really good, and it gets better from there.
Cool.
I really
Cool.
like that one.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And yeah, one or two others. I love The Haunter of the Dark. Every time I read the first half of The Haunter of the Dark, I still get chills, even though I know what's happening.
Is that another
I know where
Lovecraft
it's
one?
going. As a Lovecraft one as well, yeah.
Yeah.
The
Wow.
the one where the guy goes up into the church.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's funny
it's
because
fucking brilliant.
I
It's a great
thought
one.
I'd read a bunch of Lovecraft because I've got a big tome and I've also got like this big audiobook that's like literally all his stuff, but I haven't heard
Yeah,
either of those. So I got to go home and read those. I go like
no, it's okay.
Patty gave me a tome, like it's called the Necronomicon. It's this big thick fucking book. So I'll
Awesome.
go home and read them. That's great. So The Haunter in the
Yeah.
Dark and Whisperer in the Dark. Was that it?
Yes. Also, if you haven't read The Thing on the Doorstep, I don't think it's one of his scarier ones, but it's probably one of my favorite ones of
Thing on
his.
the
It's really good.
Doorstep. Yeah, that definitely rings a bell.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one's brilliant.
Yeah.
And they're nice and short. Like they're I think he does the short and sweet kind of horror story quite well.
There's that thing about Lovecraft as well that it's like the thing I was talking about that like, oh wow, this is a lot more because you can do a straight like tension thing like with
Yeah,
say a serial killer or something that doesn't seem to appeal to me as much, but as soon as you've got that outside element, there's that weird fiction component to it.
Yeah.
It really makes things like, well, this is just operating on a different level to what I expected it was, and he does that really well. Like, what's my favorite one of his is probably The Color Out of Space, which is just,
Mm,
I'd say, from a
yeah.
purely terrifying perspective, is not that scary, but it's just really fascinating to see how um, this place degrades. So it's the idea is that, like, this guy is he's actually a surveyor, I think, because they're going to make this dam, like a well sort of thing. And he's coming in and having a look and talking to all the people. And they're like, "Oh, go talk to Old Army. He's like, he knows about all the old history of this place." So he goes and he talks to this guy, and the guy's like, "Yeah, this is all like, what are they called? Is that the one with the blasted heath? I think. Yeah, they're like, this place used to be really nice and verdant and stuff, but this thing happened. Like, this meteor came down, and a friend of mine, uh, he discovered it, and it basically landed on his property. And the whole story, the crux of the story, is really just Army, this old kind of guy, telling him the story of this corrupting force that sort of very slowly over the process of, like, I think several years, just like ekes its way out from this thing. And sort of, at first it makes the animals look really strange, and then it, like, the turnips and vegetables go really big, but they're completely inedible. And then eventually it starts warping the mind of these people. And, like, at the end, it's just like, there's this really horrifying scene of him dealing with his friend, like actually having to deal with the specter of what this guy's become. And it's really chilling. It's one of the most, like, probably one of the most disturbing Lovecraft scenes I've read, in a good way. Yeah, and that sense of just, like, there's a spreading corruption, but it's like, it's not even really knowable. It's not even like something that you can be like, oh yeah, it's this poison thing that's, like, slowly killing. No, this is, like, completely shifting the geography of the land. Like, the trees start to, like kind of, like, do almost like turn into hands and things. It's very strange, which is it's horrific, but it's also strange, which I think is a big thing. Um, I kind of wanted to turn into that. Where do you like? How do you find the crossover between weird or strange fiction and horror? Like, what's your relationship with that intersection?
Interesting. I don't really know where I would. I guess I would see horror as kind of like more. I guess I would see horror as more expansive. Like horror could include ghost stories,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
even like horror doesn't necessarily need to involve the supernatural or kind of things
No,
that
I
are
guess it
real
doesn't.
necessarily.
No, you could
It
have you could
it,
have like
it
serial
almost
killers.
always does. I can't really think of an example at the moment where it isn't, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And I guess weird fiction is where it kind of drifts into. For me, I think it usually drifts into kind of science fiction space kind of stuff,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
kind of
for sure.
the larger scale, and it
Or
just
even
happens to
fantasy.
be horrifying.
Yeah,
It just happens to be that that's very scary,
yeah,
more
exactly. I
so than
mean,
thing,
well, yeah,
right?
space is a big empty void. So, it's like, that's what they call it.
Yeah,
Cosmic horror is another phrase for it.
yeah.
And my relationship to that stuff is just, I don't know. It's like, so I'm writing something now for our new anthology that's sort of leaning into cosmic territory. Like, the whole thing is, and you'll hear this is a pattern. The whole thing is, it starts very, very small and narrow, and it's like, oh, well, there's a bunch of, like, there's like a military group, and they're going in and they're going to try and find this thing, right? And there's, like, it's a big, like, Stalingrad esque, like, burnt out city. And they have to navigate their way through it, and there's traps and pitfalls and stuff. But as it gets further on, you realize that what they're there for, and what's happening to them, is very different to what they think is happening. And I haven't actually gotten up to writing that part, but I feel like,
Cool.
that's that twist. That sort of, it's not even a twist. It's more like a slow crank. It's more like, oh, this is almost like a vice, like prying something apart. It's like, oh wow, this is a lot different than I thought it would be.
Where do you feel like the inspiration for that comes from? Does it come from more, do you have the idea and then you're like, this is a horror story? Or does it come from, I guess, the other direction where it's not that horror is the best way to tell the story, but it's that that's the story you wanted to tell a horror story with, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. I think, well, I almost always start with place. I don't know why, but
Cool.
I
Okay.
always start with like, where is this set? Like I get just the inspiration. Like I wrote one a while ago called The Last Great American Stallion, which was like, oh, it's petrol station. It's a petrol station in Arizona. That's just such a fun thing to start from. And
Nice.
this
Okay.
one I literally started with the idea of a burn shadow. Have you ever heard of that? It's like a nuclear burn radius,
Yes.
right? And I was
Yeah.
like, that's really cool. And then I was thinking about like people taking pot shots at each other, and I'm like, well, what if that was like in this burnt out city? Like what if that was part of it? Someone had bombed this city. And then the weird aspect sort of came later when I was talking to Patty, which I won't spoil too much about now, but is yeah, things definitely get a bit stranger. So yeah, I always start from place and kind of go from there. And I'm a big fan of the marrying of ideas as well. Like you have two totally disparate concepts and kind of smash them together and see what happens.
Cool. Okay. Yeah.
Well, what about you? Where do you sort of do you find yourself more being like, I'm going to tell a horror story, or is it more like that just kind of grows out of what it is?
Yeah. It's usually that it grows out of what it is. I'll either have something. I kind of might have a bunch of concepts that I'm working with that I'm already kind of interested in telling a story, and then I end up saying like, how am I going to frame this? Oh, this has to be framed in um like what's the like when I start thinking about what's the character arc and stuff going to be, I'm like, oh, and it's going to be a horror story, so it's almost always going to involve
Yeah,
um that kind of setup, tension, and a kind of crash ending. And I
yeah,
think I usually end up writing stuff that I feel is kind of like a bit of a cautionary tale, and that the characters have sort of made fumbled up in some way,
yeah,
and then it's going to be, usually it's either like, do they figure it out by the end or do they not? And I quite like having them not figure it out, so it tends
yeah,
to fit the horror much better. Sometimes I will just come across something and I'm like, I immediately recognize like that's a horror story. Like it's a great horror story. It's got all the elements there already.
yeah,
And I would rarely find as I'm writing it that it would change from being into something else.
yeah, yeah,
Usually if it
yeah.
starts as a horror story, it stays as a horror story.
Yeah, it's a very very technical genre horror because there is this long runway of tension that needs to build up and then it needs to pay off in one way or another. Um so and that starts with atmosphere, and I think you're very good at building atmosphere in your writing, which is like you're informed this is a horror story often before you see anything horrific. Like not always,
Yeah.
sometimes it can start a little bit more light and fluffy and then it can go into that. But usually it will be like, hey, the there'll be this sense of things not being right, like the trees are whispering in a weird way, or like he's got this clamminess on the back of his neck, the main character, or like something like that. There'll just be this sense of like things are not as they should be, things are not
Yeah.
right, not
You
at
kind of
right.
want to make the reader uncomfortable before they know what they're supposed to be uncomfortable, what they're supposed to be worried about. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
kind of want to
totally.
give them a sense that something, yeah, just that something's going on, something isn't right, or that, yeah,
I think the best book I've read that does that, that brings that sense of discomfort without you knowing what's going on for a long, long time, a really long time, is I'm thinking of ending things. Have you
okay,
ever read that?
haven't read that one.
Oh man, you would love that book.
Okay,
It's it's like deeply unsettling very early, but not because there's anything necessarily happening. Like it's just about this girl who's going on a road trip with a boyfriend who she's thinking of breaking up with. She's like, well, I'll meet his parents and we'll sort of see what happens. But like she's thinking of that, and it's just the way it kind of plays out is just uh really chilling and heartbreaking, and yeah, that one really stayed with me, in that sense of like, again, not so much the scare but just the like you put it down and just go, wow, that was a gut punch,
cool. Okay,
I really really recommend reading that book. It's quite short too, it's only like that big. I think Netflix
yeah.
did a version of it, but I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I do remember seeing that come up somewhere. I was wondering, that's probably where I've seen it.
I was going to say there's just this big runway of tension before there's actually anything even to be worried about, or if you even really know if you're meant to be worried.
Nice, yeah. The opening chapter, I think it's the opening, yes, the opening chapter of It, with Georgie sailing his little
Uh,
sailship down the river. That that does it so well as well. Like does
Oh,
like the scene is essentially quite sweet,
yeah,
but you have this terrible sense of predation, just looming predation
yeah,
within the scene, without Stephen King ever actually stating, whatever is actually stating that the child is being watched.
yeah.
That is what he creates the sense of, and
Mm.
you're obviously thinking like a person, like there's a person watching this child, and the child might be about to be kidnapped, but he intercuts like the child playing on the street with how the child had, like how his older brother had built the boat for him, and while he's doing this he has to go down into the basement because the basement is dark. He's like afraid of there
Yeah,
being a
yeah,
monster in the
yeah, yeah,
basement,
yeah.
so he
He
does a
does the
great job of setting up monster and kind of predator.
yeah.
So
But there's
you're
nothing
waiting
in
for
the
something to
basement.
happen.
That's the
Nothing in the
which
basement,
is
and there's
amazing.
nothing on the street. Yeah, everything's
Yeah.
fine, and then it goes down into the drain, and the
Yeah.
voice starts speaking to him from the drain. It's
Uh,
so good. It's such good horror,
yeah, it's really
and it's
good.
that kind of horror where he's never, the monster is there in the drain at the end of the chapter, but the
Yeah.
whole chapter just feels tense without him ever managing to, without ever doing anything or pointing at anything.
Yeah.
Really well done.
I think Stephen King is at his best when he's writing short things, and that is essentially like
Mm,
a short story, really. And
mm,
it's a really good, like, actually, it I think is one of the few really long books of his where it maintains a pretty good tension the whole way through. But I think he really excels in shorter pieces generally. There are exceptions, like yeah, I mean, he's got some very good long works, like The Shining is obviously incredible. Um, Lacey's story is actually really good. It's really long, and it does flag a bit, but that's a really good one. But I think like, personally, I think his best work is probably something like The Mist. Like, it's really hard for me to think of a single better, like, just piece of fiction that he's
mm.
done in terms of building.
You quite like The Stand, don't you?
I
The
do,
Stand,
yeah, that's actually
which is
true. I
massive.
really do like
Yeah.
The Stand, but it
Have
is
you
very
read
long.
his? Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I read the his own extended version where like
yeah,
the stuff that the editor had said to take out, he had put
yeah.
in. That's the
Oh, that's
original
the
that I
stuff with
read.
the, like, the trash can man, right? And
Is the Trash Can Man not in the original?
no, he is, but I think
Oh, okay.
it's vastly cut down. But there's some actually really
No
good stuff
way.
in the extended stuff, like some
Yeah,
really
yeah.
good ones.
I thought there was a lot of very good stuff.
Yeah,
I wonder if the ending feels like it drags, but I don't know what the original ending is.
yeah. I think I read
Um,
the extended version actually, and in fairness, I'm actually struggling to think of a part where that book drags. Maybe when they're in the homestead with in what is it? Not Columbus. The mountains with
yeah.
that.
Booming or something, or
Yeah, something like that. Yeah,
trying to remember.
that maybe drags a bit, but that
Boulder,
actually, Boulder, Ohio,
Boulder. Yeah.
Boulder,
Have you
Boulder,
have you
Colorado.
read Under the Dome by Stephen
I
King?
haven't. No, no, no.
That's another big one with a huge cast, and I think
Okay,
that might be one of my favorite of his books.
okay, yeah, cool. I really
That is
like the
really, really
idea
good.
of that. It's just so weird. It's just so like,
Yeah, yeah.
there's a big shell. Like, we just put a
Just
big,
drop a shell on. But
just
yeah,
a big, like, salad bowl. Just put it down on.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
See how well they get along.
yeah, exactly. No, that's great.
That's a great one. Yeah. Have
Yeah.
you read any of his Gunslinger series?
I have no, only the short stories within that universe.
Okay.
I'm a little bit intimidated of getting into that, to be honest. I will at some
Right.
point.
Okay.
Well, I will one day,
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't know. How do you find that?
I really, really like them. I think probably three of them are like some of my favorite books. If you know what I mean?
Yep.
Like if you were to ask me like what are my maybe 10, if you ask me what my 12 favorite books were, three of the
Plenty.
Gunslinger series would be in there for sure. For different reasons, because each of them has a different feel to them.
Okay.
As
High
it goes
praise.
along.
And
Because
they're big
he
books too,
wrote
aren't
them.
they?
Some of them are quite big, and some of them are smaller. And like, his first two are fairly small, and they're brilliant. I thought the third one wasn't great, and then I thought the fourth one was the best. Like I thought it was so good.
Right.
And then you're at that point, you're so invested in the characters that you're going to
Sure.
finish it to see where it goes.
Yeah. Okay.
But it's definitely worth checking it out. He puts so much into them that there might be parts where you're like, I'm not that into this
Right. Okay.
conflict, or I'm not that into this plot line.
Yeah.
But you'll get into something else later on, which is really,
Okay.
really good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. He's a cool character, Roland. Like, just this you know, just this cowboy in some sort of fantastical land.
Yeah, like this like knightly cowboy who has lived 100 years or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fun stuff. And the other characters, the cast of characters he has around him are brilliant.
Yeah, I remember the one story, yeah, I think it's in maybe Night Shift, where he's like he basically goes and gets kidnapped by these the Sisters of Mercy or something, or like and they basically trap him and like feed him this stuff that keeps him really weak, and then one of the sisters has a crush on him, so she like lets him go, but like yeah, it kind of goes from there.
Oh, this
That's
is like
good.
a Roland story
Yeah,
from
yeah,
the
yeah,
Continuity. Oh, cool. Okay, okay,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
cool.
yeah. It's good.
I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about kind of ending a story? Like, what are some examples of like a good ending from a horror story that you've read yourself, and
Yeah.
then what do you aim for in your own?
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's very difficult to stick a landing in horror because inherently, the the tension you've built up has got this whole big thing attached to it. So you have to do something either really explosive and like wow, or really subversive and just totally. So I'm trying to think of the ending, the like a really good ending of a horror story. I don't know. It's like I really like twist endings, but I don't necessarily always associate them with horror stories because the notion of a horror story is such that this has to end uh, in some way. Like you're building up to something, whereas a twist story will often be a little bit different. It'll kind of go like a left field, and because it's not so boxed into that suspense narrative, it can kind of move more with that. Like so a horror ending is really strange. I have to say, I would say, yeah, the end of I'm thinking of ending things is really, really good at that twist, and it just comes totally out of left field. Like it feels earned. You can see how they got there, but you're just like, wow,
Mhm.
that was just sort of crazy. Lovecraft is pretty good at ending things as well, usually. Like sometimes it's just such a roll of the dice. Like I one of my favorite endings is actually from a Stephen King book that's one of my least favorite of his, and that is Revival. It's just this. Have you ever read that one?
Haven't read that one now.
Okay, well, it's basically just about this um, kind of this traveling musician who gets caught up with this guy who's kind of found a power source to another world, who's like a preacher, and he like puts hands on people, and like a lot of these people end up dying. Like they'll have a illness of theirs take removed, but then they'll like just die years later, like of mysterious causes. So he's hunting him down, and the end of that just goes totally left field into this like this totally Lovecraftian. There's this netherworld thing where this like big like queen monster is basically devouring the soul of these people, and a lot of people really hate it, and they're like, that was just stupid, that came from nowhere, but I thought it was the best bit of the whole book.
Oh, right,
um
okay.
so yeah, Stephen King's endings are very, very hit or miss. I don't know, I think it would have to be something that, okay, so it would have to be something that it resolves it in a way that was not expected or not entirely expected, but felt earned.
Mm,
That
yeah, that's actually very well put. Yeah.
yeah, I think that would be my thing there. I'm struggling to think of anything off the top of my head right now, but
One of my favorite examples is the girl with the gifts, the girl with all the gifts, the
oh
zombie one.
yeah, I just read that
Like I
actually.
think I think they nail the ending of a horror story with that book.
Let's talk about that because I've just read it as well.
Yeah, the story kind of involves this young girl and kind of three or four other characters um traveling from A to B, zombie apocalypse. And as you get to know each of the characters, you kind of get to know that each of them has like conflicting wants. And then each of them has like a win state and a lose state.
Yeah,
But by the time you get to the end of the story, you know that if one of the characters gets what they want, the other characters are kind of all going to end up screwed.
yeah,
But I won't get into what happens, but like the horror of what happens in the ending manages to like you were saying, resolve each of the storylines,
yeah,
do it
yeah,
in a way which wasn't expected, and then kind of hits you over the head with like that's also fucking terrible.
yeah, yeah.
So
True,
that's
true, true.
always like that's kind of been since I read that was kind of like, well, that's how I would like to end a story. But very much like you said, like you wanted to resolve an unexpected way, but still feel earned.
Yeah, it definitely does feel earned and very grim, but at the same time, weirdly hopeful. There is a hopefulness to it.
I didn't feel that at all.
You don't think so? Okay.
Not
I
at
know. I
all.
think there was, because there was like,
Okay.
it's basically like most must die, so if the select few shall live is essentially the crux of it. And I thought, okay, I get from one perspective where that's at least coming from. I guess it's not really something we can discuss over a podcast without like spoiling.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
Yeah, but we might have a chat about that later, because I do want to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I would definitely do a podcast just on that book. Like, I really love it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably about it, I reckon. Do you have any last thoughts on, I don't know, what makes a good horror book or story? Or
No, I guess as long as it kind of gets under your skin, as long as it kind of creeps you out. I guess as long as there's something about kind of like, pointing at the room and saying that's a dangerous room, don't go in there. And the character's like, nah, it's probably not that dangerous, and they go in anyway. Yeah. And then realizing that they've made a terrible mistake. Just something about that just feels really really satisfying.
Yeah, that realization, that sense of like, oh, now I've fucked up, or like, oh, this is really, it's that oh shit moment that I think really sells it, because everything before that's been building up. And if you've done it correctly, that oh shit moment is really just the beginning of the actual thing, right?
Yeah.
Because then there's a whole other arc you can go on. We're like, well, how do we get out of this? And what do we sort of do? But yeah, it's for such a constrained genre, structurally, there is really so much to play with, which I really enjoy. Yeah.
So yeah,
cool.
Write horror, or read horror.
Yeah, that's it. Do both. Do both if you can.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, look, I'll do our plugs. So thanks for listening, guys. I hope you've appreciated it. Look, we would really love a review on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever medium you listen to it. Spotify, you can do it, just because it helps us get a little bit more traffic, which is good. And also, we have an anthology of stories, at least 2 of which are horror. I think half of them are actually technically horror. Yours, mine.
I think,
I mean, yours is kind of more on the science fiction thing, and there's definitely horror elements, but it's
tense, but not necessarily horror.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're interested in learning more about what we've done, you can find that. It's the new Mythic, and you can find that at Amazon. Just look for Precipice Fiction, and you can also find that. But until next time, adios, and keep reading and writing horror.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cool. All right, that's good.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.